everyone, Megan here to tell you about one of my new favorite decks in Modern. And look, I know you've probably heard me say this before. Called Blue-Red Taking Turns, and it's pure magic. My name is Megan, and I'm here to tell you about a second chance at love. And also Modern Elves. Look, Modern is like the cheese section at a grocery store. There are a lot of kinds of cheese, like really a lot, and I don't understand the difference between all of them. But at the end of the day, I'm just a person who thinks cheese is great. Anyway, enough about cheese. I'm so excited to tell you about the Valakut deck I've been piloting lately, which I've been calling Hour of Valakut, or Hour of Scapeshift, or honestly just this new Valakut deck I've been playing lately. The deck is powerful, flexible, and fun, like Superman at a Halloween party. It uses a lot of ramp spells, plus mountains and Valakut the Molten Pinnacle to kill your opponent, sometimes with a Scapeshift or a Primeval Titan, but sometimes just by making land drops. While the basics of this deck are straightforward, you're playing ramp spells, trying not to die, and casting a finisher, there are a lot of interesting decisions about the lands you get and the order in which you cast your spells, and making the correct decision can mean the difference between winning and losing. And the thing is, you're making a lot of decisions, and they could all be the decision that matters most, so you need to be thinking about the short term and the long term all the time. This deck generally has really good creature matchups. If there are a lot of Collected Company decks in your area, that's pretty good for you. Things like Naya or Bant Value, classic Jund or Abzan, or Elves I've found to be favorable. I've also found it to be solid against Storm. It does have a little more trouble with hyper-aggressive creature decks with a lot of disruption. Merfolk, for example, or Grixis Death's Shadow. There have been a lot of different Valakut decks over the years, but the one we're looking at today is one of the most recent versions, with 3 copies of Hour of Promise, a new addition from Hour of Devastation. This is my favorite version of the deck so far because it's one of the most flexible and consistent. There are a lot of different tools, like Prismatic Omen, Scapeshift, and Hour of Promise, that you can use to put together a winning game plan. This deck's objective is to deal lethal damage to your opponent using Valakut the Molten Pinnacle to turn our mountains into bolt hills. Maria! Does that joke work?
No!
One of the great things about this deck is that there are a lot of ways that you can go about accomplishing that. Maybe you cast a Scapeshift, maybe you cast a Primeval Titan, maybe you just keep making land drops and eventually get the job done. A perfect opening hand is going to have a few lands, ramp spells, and ideally, just one of your finishers. If a hand only has ramp spells, that's not the worst thing that could happen. But if you have a few lands and all finishers, that's a hand you're more likely to mulligan, because otherwise, you might just die. So, let's take a look at what actually makes up the deck. Afterwards, I'll have a couple more tips for piloting it that are easier to talk about once we've covered the specific cards we're working with. First, we have to talk about the land that makes Scapeshift and the rest of the crew all worthwhile. Valakut the Molten Pinnacle is a land from the original Zendikar block that says when a mountain enters the battlefield under your control, if you control at least 5 other mountains, you can have Valakut deal 3 damage to target creature or player. It's important to remember that, for as much as Valakut loves mountains, it isn't one. Just like, even though I like cheese, I'm not cheese. I think. With that out of the way, we're ready to talk about the spells we've put together around it. First, we have all of our ramp spells. Search for Tomorrow is one of the best because it puts the land into play untapped, and it's the only ramp spell you can cast on turn 1. I put cast in quotes because we're actually suspending it. Suspending a Search for Tomorrow on turn 1 feels like planning a birthday party because it's not your birthday yet, but you know it's coming soon and it's gonna be great. Next, there's Farseek, which can get you a mountain, Cinderglade, or Stomping Ground and put it into play tapped. There's also Sakura Tribe Elder, a 1/1 that you can sacrifice to get a basic land. A lot of the time, you're just going to play it and sacrifice it on your opponent's turn, maybe after blocking one of your opponent's attackers. But there are times when you might keep the Sakura Tribe Elder around to, surprisingly, attack your opponent. It's easier to kill an opponent with Scape Shift if they're at 18, and while in Modern a lot of people will be really nice and deal themselves at least 2 damage with Fetch Lands, Shock Lands, or Thoughtseizes, sometimes you have to do the work yourself. Then there's 2 copies of Explore, which isn't as great because you do need another land in hand to make it work. This is the card I'm most likely to board out in games 2 and 3, but it does have the upside of drawing you a card and of putting another land into play untapped. Finally, we have a single Wood Elves. Because of its text, you can get a Stomping Ground or a Cinderglade with Wood Elves, which is great because those lands both count as mountains for Valakut triggers and help you cast your double green finishers like Primeval Titans and Scape Shift. Like Sakura Tribe Elder, Wood Elves, though just a little 1/1, can block a creature and save us some damage, or deal a critical point or 2 to our opponent. Now we move on to Hour of Promise. It's not quite the same as our other ramp spells because this one lets us get any 2 lands out of our deck, which means that we can get 2 Valakuts or a Valakut and a mountain when we cast it, meaning it better furthers our game plan than some of our other ramp. It also takes us from 5 lands to 7 in one fell swoop, and 7 is usually the magic number for Scape Shifting. Which brings us to one of our 2 big win conditions, Scape Shift. Scape Shift lets us sacrifice any number of our lands and then search that many lands out of our deck and put them into play. Remember Valakut, which will deal 3 damage when a mountain enters the battlefield if there are at least 5 other mountains? Well, with Scape Shift, if you sacrifice 7 lands and get, say, 1 Valakut and 6 mountains, all 6 of those mountains are entering the battlefield at the same time, and they and Valakut all see 5 other mountains as they're entering, so you're going to get 6 triggers, which equals 18 damage. I said 7 lands is usually the magic number for Scape Shift, and that's because your opponent will often be at 18 or lower when you cast it, so that damage from 1 Valakut and 6 mountains will be lethal. If they're not at or below 18 life, that's okay. You can just Scape Shift once you have 8 lands. That'll get you 2 Valakuts and 6 mountains for a total of 12 triggers and 36 damage. We also have 4 copies of Primeval Titan, which is a giant 6/6 trample creature that can both block and hit for a ton of damage. Even more importantly, when it comes into play, it searches up any 2 lands from your deck and does the same when it attacks. Like Hour of Promise, this means you can get any combination of Valakuts and mountains that you need to deal damage. One really nice upside of Primeval Titan is that it gets around a lot of the counter magic that decks like Grixis Death's Shadow have, mostly Stubborn Denial, that targets non-creature spells. Then we have 2 Summoners packs to get our Primeval Titans, or after Sideboard, one of our other green creatures. Remember, even though Summoner's Pact is an instant, casting it on your turn and playing the creature you get right away is the right thing to do in a lot of situations. It's also a really good idea to give yourself some kind of marker or reminder so you don't accidentally die to the upkeep trigger. If you've already drawn your card for the turn, it's too late and you're dead. So putting a die on top of your library works for a lot of players. Then we have Prismatic Omen, which is an enchantment that says that lands you control are every basic land type in addition to their other types. We only have 2 copies of Prismatic Omen because without Valakuts, it does next to nothing. But it also allows for some of the deck's earliest possible combos. With Prismatic Omen, you can Scape Shift on just 6 lands because your Valakuts count themselves as mountains. You can get 2 Valakuts with Hour of Promise or Primeval Titan and deal 12 damage. Your fetch lands deal damage when they come into play and when you fetch with them. It's pretty neat. Also, by the way, we have 3 lightning bolts. They're mostly to kill creatures. Sometimes they're to point at your opponent's face. They're lightning bolts. You'll figure it out. Now for the rest of our lands. We have 3 copies of Windswept Heath, which stinks because you can't just get a mountain with it, which is what you want to do sometimes. Still, you gotta work with what you have, and that's it. Then we have 4 copies of Wooded Foothills, which can fetch us Stomping Grounds and Cinderglades and mountains and forests, oh my. But usually Cinderglades are Stomping Grounds. Fetch lands are cool because if you have enough lands to cast your spells without cracking them, they can function as bolts for later. If you don't have a Valakut yet, you can just sit on them, then get mountains when you're ready to bolt your opponent or their creatures if you really need to. Then we have 3 copies each of Stomping Ground and Cinderglade, which, very importantly, have the land type mountain. Finally, we have our basics, 7 mountains and 3 forests. Sometimes basic forest will be fine, like when you're using it to cast Scapeshift. Sometimes you will never be so disappointed by a forest. Not even if someone told you were going to see the giant redwoods and you ended up seeing a picnic table and some tall grass instead. That brings us to the sideboard. There's Ancient Grudge and Reclamation Sage for destroying artifacts. There's also Beast Within for destroying lots of other problematic permanents, from Tron lands to Liliana of the Vales to other people's Primeval Titans or Valakuts. There's Obstinate Baloth and Thragtusk, which gain life and provide blockers against burn or other iterations of aggro decks. I also like to bring them in against Grixis Death's Shadow because again, they'll get around a lot of their counter magic and they usually reduce their own life total low enough that 1 or 2 attacks can finish them off. There's 2 Anger of the Gods for very creature-heavy decks. Chandra Flamecaller is also a great sweeper, and I'll bring it in against creature decks as well as against control decks. There are 2 Relic of Progenitus, which are great against decks with Snapcaster Mages and Delve cards, and against Storm, because it shuts down Past in Flames pretty well. Guttural Response is obviously for bringing in against blue decks, and combo like Ad Nauseam, to help you resolve your one most critical spell. 2 Witchbane Orb are good in the mirror, and against anything where it's critical for your opponent to target you, which can also mean stuff like burn. Finally, my particular build has 1 Crucible of Worlds, because there's a fair amount of land destruction, or Panza, in my local metagame. A fair number of the green-based Collected Company value creature decks are playing Ramunat Excavator and Ghost Quarter these days, so it's also good against that. And that's it for the deck. A few final notes before I go. Check your temptation to bolt your opponent's creatures. Sometimes it's right, but sometimes it can give them an entire extra turn or 2. Always do the math. Before you search for lands, do the math. Before you Scapeshift, do the math. Before you bolt a creature with a Valakut trigger, do the math. If your opponent has ways to destroy lands, you're going to want to Scapeshift for 1 more land than you otherwise would, and you'll want to make that land a mountain, not a Valakut. That's because the Valakut trigger is an intervening if. When the mountain enters the battlefield, Valakut will check for 5 other mountains. If they're there, the Valakut trigger will go on the stack. Then, before the trigger resolves, it'll check again. When the trigger is on the stack, an opponent can destroy a mountain with, say, a Tectonic Edge, and the trigger won't resolve because you no longer have 5 other mountains. If an opponent casts Shadow of a Doubt or Aven Mind Sensor in response to your Scapeshift, you don't have to sacrifice any of your lands. Remember, Scapeshift lets you choose how many, and that number can be 0 if something bad has happened. If your opponent has let you choose how many lands to sacrifice, the spell is already resolving, and they can't do anything until it's done resolving and your Valakut triggers or other triggers are on the stack. And that's Hour of Valakut, or Hour of Scapeshift, or Hour of Primeval Titan. You can decide for yourself, but as always, good luck, high five.